the last question I wanted to get to regarding just what triple O is before we turn to some of its extensions is that in one place I saw you write that philosophy generally, as you see it, has a closer relationship with aesthetics than with mathematics or natural science. And then in another place, you wrote that one principle of triple O is that aesthetics is first philosophy. And I was wondering just what this means.
Right. And actually, what it meant in the original instance is that philosophy, like the arts, is something non-literalist in the sense I was saying before, that you're not going to be able to paraphrase an artwork, a poem, or a painting. And this has been known for a long time by literary critics. And of course, it's been known for a long time in analytic philosophy that you can't really paraphrase metaphors. Max Black was writing about that already back in the 60s. You can't really say what it means that the chairman plowed through the discussion, is his example, or man is a wolf, his other example. And so that's been out there for a while, both in literary criticism and in analytic philosophy, and then in continental philosophy and Jose Ortega y Gasset, another of my great influences, the Spanish philosopher of the early 20th century. And so what I was trying to stress when I talked about the close kinship of philosophy and the arts was the non-literalist aspects. I've since started to regret that a bit because, again, that was sounding too one-sidedly continental, right? It was sounding too much like a science does not think position, which is not what I want to say. And I'm actually quite fascinated by the philosophy of science and the history of science. I spent a lot of time on history of science as an undergraduate, one of my passions. And so I'm going to be publishing more about the philosophy of science in the near future to try to balance those scales a little bit better. Because philosophy is also not identical with the arts, right? The arts are trying to produce a kind of object quality tension, and that's not quite what philosophy is trying to do. Philosophy is not just an artwork. So you'll hear more from me about that in the future once I've figured out exactly what I think about the difference between philosophy and the arts. But when you talk about aesthetics as first philosophy, well, I'm trying to talk about aesthetics in a wider sense, aesthetics in the sense of non-literalism. So if you look up object-oriented ontology somewhere, what most of its defenders and detractors are going to say is that object-oriented ontology believes in the withdrawal of the real from any direct access. And that's okay, that's there, but you don't need triple O for that. You can get that from Kant, you can get that from Heidegger. You might be able to get that from more ancient sources too. So it's only part of it. What triple O is really about is about the tension between objects and their own qualities. The fact that an object both has and does not have its own qualities. That's the paradox. So what is the relation between an object and its own qualities? You have to drive that wedge between. And I use aesthetics as the term for an area of human experience where that is happening most obviously. So in the case of an aesthetic work, there are obviously qualities there. We can describe what some of the qualities of a sculpture or a poem are. And yet the actual aesthetic object remains somewhat elusive. We cannot literalize it. So you have a real object with sensual qualities. That's the tension. Just like you have in Heidegger's tool analysis, where when the hammer breaks, you become attentive to some of its qualities, but you still don't really know what the hammer is. You're aware of its existence, but it's not like you've been able to paraphrase the hammer successfully once it breaks. You're just aware that it's there. It's drawn attention to itself as something somehow mysterious. Well, for phenomenological reasons, I hold that you can't really have qualities without an underlying object holding them together. But this is a mysterious case since the object withdraws from direct access. What is it that holds the qualities together? And my interpretation is that it's I myself as real objects that holds the qualities together. So for instance, when I'm reading the poem and I hear Homer's metaphor, wine dark sea, the wine qualities are there for the taking. It's the sea, this wine-like sea, that is mysterious and ungraspable. And the only way that metaphor works is if I perform it mentally myself. I have to somehow try, difficult though it is, to become the sea with wine-like qualities. So there's a performative dimension to the arts there. Interestingly, one that is excluded by Kantian aesthetics, which requires a disinterest and a distance by the spectator from the work. And also in formalist art criticism of the 20th century that followed from Kant, like Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried, so-called formalist criticism, is very much based on the paradigm of the distant observer who is not emotionally involved with the artwork, who describes in disinterested fashion. I don't think that's possible. I think that aesthetics requires a performance. In fact, I think performance art was probably the first artwork historically. I can't prove that, but I suspect it. And so there's a kind of reality in which we, the beholder, become directly involved in a way that isn't true in literalist experience, where we're simply describing. And so, for instance, you could have insincere scientists, right? Because the constraint on scientists is evidence. The constraint on scientists is justification, not truth. Right? If we talk about justified true belief, scientists simply have to be constrained by the best available evidence. They don't have to believe in the ultimate truth of whatever theory they're having. Whereas in philosophy, it's a little different, and certainly in the arts, it's very different. In philosophy, for instance, there are certain cases where we're committing to truth without sufficient justification. That's the Kierkegaardian moment of philosophy, that you're never going to have enough time to decide whether Christianity is true or false. There's never going to be enough evidence for or against. We have a finite lifespan. You're going to have to make the decision to become a Christian or not, or whatever it is, or not. Our convictions always outrun our evidence. And that's the performative side of philosophy, the sincere side of philosophy that is absolutely essential in the sphere of the arts. Now, what's interesting is that this also comes up in philosophy of science sometimes. There's a moment where Karl Popper is backed into a corner and says that attempts to falsify theories must be sincere, which is kind of funny. You wouldn't think sincerity would come up in the case of science. And then I think is it Popper or Lakatos commenting on him who says, but the requirement of sincerity cannot be formalized, which I thought was a brilliant line. There's no way to formalize that this statement is also sincere. It's not something that could have been said ironically. So philosophy requires that we're putting ourselves on the table. We're putting ourselves into play with whatever doctrine we are advocating. That devil's advocate is somehow out of place in philosophy, strangely enough, in a way that it's not out of place in the sciences. And it would be totally out of place in the arts, which is ironic because the arts have drifted more and more towards irony across the decades since the 60s. And I think that's probably shot its wad. And it's time for art to take a different direction from irony. But that's maybe another topic.